All right, now we're going to build this hero component, also called a banner. So here we have a block that is dark and it's skewed to the left. In this block, we have a 2-column grid. In the first column, we have some content, and in the second column, we have an image. So here's the desktop version. On mobile, we have a 1-column grid. Now we have all the essential components to build this bigger component. So back to our project. First, we're going to grab this image, banner.png, and add it to our project. Good. Now, let's go to index.html. We can represent this component using the section element. So we're going to add a section with a few classes: block, block dark, and block skewed left. Good. Now, inside the section, we're going to have a grid. So we had a div with 2 classes, grid and grid 1x2. Good. Now, if you look at the desktop version of our design, you can see that the content of this component is constrained by a container that is 1140 pixels wide. So one way to implement this is to add a div with the class of container, and then we move the grid inside this container. That's one way. Another way is to apply the container class right here. So we're going to have a container, which also happens to be a 2-column grid. So I'm going to get rid of this unnecessary element. Good. So we have our container. Now our elements. So in our first column, we're going to have an H1 element followed by a paragraph and a button. We should wrap all these elements inside a container, so that container is going to be the first item in our grid. So let's add a div with the class of hero content. Now in this container, we're going to have an H1. The label is cloud hosting for pros. Next, we have a paragraph that says deploy your websites in less than 60 seconds. Good. And then we have a button. Well, technically, we have an anchor because when the user clicks on the button, they should be navigated perhaps to the sign up page. So I'm going to add an anchor with 2 classes, btn and btn accent. Actually, we need one more class because as you can see, this button is a little bit stretched. So the third class is btn stretched. Good. And the label is get started. So that is our first grid item that is going to go in the first column. Now, the image for the second column. We add an image and set the source to images/banner.png. Now, I'm not going to set the alt attribute because this image is purely for decoration. So let's see what we get up to this point. All right. First of all, our heading has this bluish kind of color. And second, there's so much space between these lines. Let's see where is this coming from. So we inspect this element. Here in the computer tab, we look at the line height property. So look, this is coming from the style that we defined at the beginning of the course. So earlier, we set the line height for the body element to 1.5. This is great for body text, but it doesn't look good for our headings. We want our headings to be compact. So back to our style sheet, in the topography section, we have this rule for our headings. In the same rule, I'm going to set the line height to 1.1. Now, that looks better. Next, we should fix the color. So earlier we defined this rule and said, if you have a dark block, the headings should be white. So back to our markup. Here's our heading. We should give it a class called block heading. Good. That looks better. Next, we need to work on this text. Here's our paragraph. I'm going to give it a class called hero _tagline. Now, back to our style sheet. In the hero section, we're going to define a rule for our tagline. Here, I'm going to set the font size to 2 rams and the color to B9 C3 CF. Now, let's see what we get. So that looks better. Now, back to our design mockup, look at the space between these letters. Here we have some more space. So back to our style sheet, we're going to set letter spacing to 1 pixel. Good. So that is closer to our design mockup. Now, currently the text is so close to the heading and the button. So we're going to give it a top margin of 2 rams and a bottom margin of 5 rams. Okay, that is better. I just want to highlight something here. in this implementation, I've defined these properties as part of an element called tagline, which belongs to the hero component. Now, as we learn more about this website, as we build more pages, if you find out that there are other paragraphs that need the exact same style, then we should extract these styles and put them in a separate reusable class. So we want to apply object-oriented principles. We want to separate content from container, okay? Now back to the browser. On this page, we have horizontal scrolling. Look, terrible. Why is this happening? This has to do with our image. Our image is way too large, but here we want to have a responsive image that stretches to fill its container. So back to our markup, here's the image for the banner. We're going to give this a class called hero image. And then back in our style sheet, we define a new rule called hero image. Here we're going to set the width to 100%. So this solves the problem. And as we resize the browser window, the image also stretches. Great. Now, let's look at the mobile version of our design. So we have a one column grid. Now, the next thing we need to work on is the alignment of the heading and the text. Currently, these items are left aligned, but on mobile, they should be center aligned. How can we fix this? Well, earlier when we implemented the block component, we assumed that our blocks can have a header and the header should be center aligned. So we can assume that this content that we have here is the header of our block component. So back to our markup, this is the div with the class of hero content. We're going to make this the header of our block component. So first, I'm going to change the element type from div to header. And one more time here. Then I'm going to give this a second class, which is block header. Also, note the order of these classes. So first, we add more generic classes, and then we use specialized classes to overwrite the styles defined in generic classes. Okay? So now we have a block header, and with this, our content becomes center aligned. Beautiful. So I believe the mobile version looks great. The only problem we have is the angle of this block. Compare this with our design mockup. Our implementation looks more steep. So earlier we defined this polygon for clipping the blocks that are skewed to the left. These numbers don't work for our hero component. Now, one way is to change this number here to 90%. This solves the problem. Now look, here's our browser version and here's the design mockup. They look pretty similar. But what if we have other blocks that need a different polygon? So the original 80%. Well, we're going to overwrite this property in our hero component. So I'm going to copy this property. Now, in the hero section, we define a new rule and say our hero should have a different clip path, a different polygon. Now, I just told you that when listing these classes, we should start with more generic classes and then list specialized classes to overwrite styles. So this section is a block. These are the generic classes. Then we're going to add a specialized class like hero, and this will overwrite the clip path property. So take a look. Great, that solved the problem. So we're done with the mobile version. Now let's customize this for wider screens. So on tablets or wider screens, we want to left align the content. So we're going to write a new media query for screens that are wider than 768 pixels. Here we define a rule for hero content and set text align to left. Okay, good. Now I'm going to make the browser wider and see what happens. So here's what we get. Look, the text or the content is not properly aligned with the image. On wide screens, the content area should be vertically in the middle. So back to our media query, our content element is inside a grid. We want to change the vertical alignment of this item. What property are we going to use? Align self. We're going to set this to center. Now take a look. Okay, the content is right in the middle. Beautiful. So I believe we are pretty much done with this element. There is just one tiny problem. Currently, there is so much space on the top. So we should remove the top padding on wide screens. So back to our media query, we're going to define a new rule for our hero and set padding top to 0. Now, why didn't we apply this across the board for all devices? Well, on mobile, we want to have some top padding. We don't want to remove it. But on widescreens, because this image is fairly tall, it's going to naturally add some extra padding here. So we don't need to apply a top padding to the entire hero component, okay? So let's save the changes and see what we get. All right, here's the desktop version. Now let's look at tablet, looks great. And then finally, mobile. So we're done with this component. Next, we're going to talk about optimizing this image.